Good evening, and welcome to the second lecture for the lecture for week 2 of Roman and early Christian history and literature. Today we will be talking about the birth of the Republic of Rome and some of the events that led to Romans deciding that they did not care for kings at all. So to recap just a little bit, last week we talked about Rome having been founded by Romulus, so the tradition says about 753 years before Christ. You should be taking all of these dates down, and there will be more. And we talked a little bit about why the Romans were so warlike and a little bit about what their concept of honor was. I've redrawn the map of Italy from last week because I wanted to add in the Alps here, the Po River flowing across in the middle of a great plain, the Tiber River, which makes a loop, and that was very important to the development of Rome, and the Apennines, as you can see, flow down like a spine. Some of these cities, you may well recognize the names of Naples and Pompeii. One of the interesting things to note is the size of Italy. It's about 600 miles from the Arch of the Foot to the Alps. That's about the same length as from the Isle of Wight in southern England to John O'Groats, which is the most northern part of Great Britain, just to give you an idea of the scale. It's about 50 miles from Ravenna, which is over here on the heel, to Greece. So you can see why the Greeks were such an influence. And it's about 300 miles from here to here, and it's only about 100 miles from Carthage to Sicily. So you can see why the war with Carthage was really sort of inevitable. So here we are. The Romans have a small couple of villages on each side of the Tiber River on 2 of the 7 hills of Rome. They're dirt villages. There's a wall for defense. The Forum is actually a place where they bury people and also gather because it's an open place. There's no drainage. There's no aqueducts. None of the things that we associate with Rome. And the great civilization is that of the Etruscans. And the Etruscans are taking up this area within the loop of the Tiber River between the Tiber and the Adriatic. And the Etruscans are very different from the Romans. Now, we've talked a little bit about Roman religion and how at this point it's really pretty much ancestor worship. There's concern to appease the gods of the hearth, the gods of the storehouse, the spirits of the ancestors. They don't actually, in this early period, even have statues of their gods that are human in form. They actually borrow that from the Etruscans and then later on from the Greeks. The Etruscans are conquerors. We don't actually know where they came from. There's some speculation that they had come from the east, that they were displaced by some earlier war, perhaps that taking place in the conflicts between Greece and Persia, perhaps some of the issues that arose as Phoenicia grew to power, but we don't actually really know, despite a great deal of archaeology that has been done. Their language has never been fully translated, so a lot of what we have is educated guesses based on the number and type of archaeological finds. What we do know is that they were very warlike, that they wanted to expand out of this area that's sort of bounded by the Tiber and by the Adriatic, the Mediterranean, and that they saw the Romans as rivals, and the Romans saw them as rivals. You know, they're both interacting with the Tiber, so the Romans can't go north, the Etruscans can't go south. Naples and Pompeii are already starting to be important trading areas, and so there's welfare that people want. Because remember, the Greeks, after the Peloponnesian War in particular, whenever they decided that there wasn't enough for them at home, they sailed and they formed trading colonies all in here in Sicily, and eventually Marseille in France, and on into Spain. And it's actually later on the Greeks in part who trigger off part of the First Punic War. So the Romans have kings because everybody else around them have kings, and because it's a fairly normal development in civilization. And tradition tells us that there were 3 Roman kings, of whom Romulus was the first. And then they were pushed out, and there were 3 Etruscan kings, and the 2 that we hear the most about are the ones who are known as the Tarquins. And it could be that there were 2 Tarquins, and it could be that Tarquin Superbus shows up twice, and his name is recorded slightly differently. But whichever way, he comes to rule in Rome, and he is very tyrannical. Things have to be done his way. He's very quick to kill rivals. And the patricians, the original Roman families, eventually have enough, and they kick him out. And at that point, they say, we're done with having kings. And they set up this system of consuls. And the consuls are elected annually. There's 2 of them. And they don't make final decisions exactly, but they take advice from the senators, and they are in charge of implementing things that have been decided, but only for a year at a time, although you could be elected more than once. Of course, they quickly figure out that there might be a problem if the consuls don't agree and there's a crisis. So they set up also this idea that they can have somebody appointed as an imperator for 6 months, just to solve whatever the crisis is, and then he goes back out of power. And that's where Coriolanus and Cincinnatus, we started reading Plutarch's Coriolanus, and you read about Cincinnatus in Charlotte Young. That's where they come in. They come in, they do a job, they go out again. Theoretically, it doesn't always happen. But this works pretty well, and this is actually where the word emperor comes from, or will come from, several hundred years down the road. So what are these Romans like? They have iron. They don't really have a Rome that we would recognize until later. In 600 BC, they do stop burying people in the Forum, and they do pave it, but they don't have aqueducts yet. It's not the beautified city that we would recognize. And of course, that's because at this point, the Romans are very poor. They're sort of trapped here between the Apennines and the Etruscans. And down here, this is all Greek influence, except Carthage, that side of Sicily. And so the Romans don't have the wealth to beautify their city yet. But they realize very quickly that if they're going to survive as independent people, that what they're going to have to do is to conquer the Etruscans. And then, because the other Latin and Sabine and so on city-states are very unreliable allies, they're going to have to turn around and conquer them as well, and turn them into suppliers of military states, what they call client states. So they're not taxed, they keep their own government, but they're required to field an army when the Romans call on them to field an army, which is pretty clever of the Romans. They don't have to pay for it unless they need to use it. So they organize themselves, and this is one of the characteristics of the Romans as opposed to anybody else at this time. They are extremely organized. The Greeks, well, part of it is a difference in what they think is important. So the Greeks thought that the point of a well-run state was to provide people with the leisure to think about things and to discover things. The Romans thought, in large part, that the point of a well-run state was to make it possible for everybody to do their duty. And it's duty and not religion that's the most important concept to the Romans. And religion is kind of odd because it's really more of a hero tale and less of something that people get their emotional strength from than duty is. The Roman boy from early on was raised to be, especially in patrician families, was raised to be a soldier, a senator, a leader of his nation. And it was seen as the only right thing to do. Religion is there so that you have stories of the gods helping Rome through the dutifulness of Rome's citizens and through the fact that people did what they were supposed to do, that they kept their word, that they were trustworthy, that they were brave, and so on. And that's why you remember the important stories like Horatio at the bridge, which has come down to us as one of the great heroic actions of all time. He held the bridge by himself, his brothers were killed, he finally has to retreat, but by the time that he retreats, the bridge has been destroyed and Rome is saved. One man. Very important kind of a story, and as we go through, you'll see those kinds of stories cropping up again and again as later Romans look to Horatio for inspiration. And even in 17th, 18th, and 19th century AD literature, you will see Horatio and the story of Horatio at the bridge pointed to. You'll see it in biographies of generals and naval commanders and so on. So in the Romans' mind, it wasn't the individual that the gods were concerned with. The gods were concerned with the survival of the Roman state. And in fact, there's even written records of them conquering a nation or a couple of nations and those clients saying, well, how come you guys are able to conquer everything? And the Romans don't say, well, we're super well organized and we know how to fight together and we have superior arms and training, all of which was true. What they say is the gods have decided that Rome should rule. But it's Rome, not individual generals. It wasn't that the gods gave this general good strategy or whatever. And the point, it's important for people to still make their sacrifices and consult the priests for, auspicious times to do things. And when they open a new skin of wine to pour out a libation to the gods, but it's more in the form of a good luck charm than in the form of, oh, this is my personal religion. And I think we'll see when we get to early Christianity that this is one of the things that completely confuses the Romans. Like, somebody's willing to die for something they believe in, and they believe in something completely nuts. So keep that sort of in the back of your head, that it was very foreign to Roman conceptions of how the world worked. So what else do we know about the Romans? Well, they weren't discoverers or developers of knowledge, except in discoverers. Except in very practical ways. So they came up with a recipe for cement that we have yet to duplicate that still works several thousand years later. Those aqueducts, a lot of the aqueducts that they built are still extant and they still carry water. But the mathematics that they used came from the Greeks. And when Virgil wrote the Georgics, his great book on farming, most of what he was doing was making available to the Romans the work on farming that had been written by the Greek Hesiod centuries before. They weren't discoverers or developers, but what they were was spreaders. They spread knowledge, partly just because of the circumstances of the Pax Romana, and partly because they looked at the people around them and they said, wow, you've no running water. You've got, as in England, for instance, when they drained Romney Marsh, you've got these great big marshes, they're in the way, they cause disease. We took care of that in Rome. We'll show you how to do it. They carried literacy all over the empire. It's one of the things that I think we tend to forget is that the Romans were extremely literate. They were so literate that they had a graffiti problem. And there's no point in graffiti if people can't read it. So they spread that. The Greeks invented an alphabet that was something that could be used that wasn't like uniform and so on and so forth, and the Phoenicians, but it was the Romans who made literacy spread. They set up schools because Rome needed an educated population in order to have engineers and generals and soldiers and people who could, most importantly, clerks. People who could keep track of who was where when, who bought what when, and so on. So that was very important. Also, an important piece of their characteristic was they prized doing over thinking in the abstract. So they would happily think about how to build an aqueduct or an arch, but they didn't want to sit there and think about the meaning of life. And when they did think about the meaning of life, they tended to go back to Greece and translate what the Greeks had said and say, this must be what it is. Greeks were so much more able than we are. While at the same time completely despising the Greek for not being organized and able to conquer the world. It's interesting. And the Roman loved the land. That place in the chart. Both patria, fatherland, and family farm. You know, when legionaries left the legion, when they retired, that's what they got. They got a family farm where they were last stationed. And that's what they wanted. They wanted a place to start a family so that they could be remembered by their descendants throughout all time. And the fatherland itself, as both as kind of an abstract, but also as this is Rome. And this is part of the reason why the eagles that the legions carried were so very important, because they were a very physical representation of the fatherland. They valued the life of the town. They thought that it was the chief instrument of civilization, that there where all of the hustle and bustle was where things were going to develop. And yet they loved the countryside. Every patrician family who could afford to had a country estate, or several country estates, usually down in this area, or even as far out over there. They thought the challenge to life that you find in the country was valuable. They thought the pleasures of the country were valuable as an escape from town. That there was great work to be done in the town to promote civilization and the life of the state. And that the country was where you went to retire. Remember again, Cincinnatus, that you went to rest. And you'll find, reading about some of the late emperors, that one of the reasons that they're such horrible emperors is that they're never actually in Rome, but they're off at their country estates, and that's can be kind of a mixed blessing. Some of them, it was probably a good thing, they didn't matter too much. And especially, they loved the country as the mother of the nation's sons. But there was something about the countryside that took them back, if you will, to their roots. And it is important to note that in the very earliest times, they were shepherds and they were farmers. And actually, some of the early records that we have indicate that when they made sacrifices and poured out libations, it wasn't wine they poured out, but milk, because they had a very pastoral existence prior to taking up arms to defend themselves and conquer the rest of the world. They liked things to be orderly. They're known for taking over, conquering towns, and basically reassembling them in straight lines. So when the Romans took over a town or a new territory and they were going to found a town, and you can read about this in David Macaulay's City, which there should be a copy of in the class library, they would make two lines at right angles to each other, and that would be the center. And then they had rules for, you have so many little blocks, and then you have a road, and then you have so many little blocks, this way, and then you have a road this way. And so you can go to go to Marseille, for instance, in France, and you can see the Roman grid that's laid out there, which became foundational for the way that people, when cities were laid out, that's how they were laid out. So even Washington, D.C. was laid out on a grid. And that idea of laying out a city on a grid was invented by the Romans. They surveyed things. They took censuses. Every 5 years, they took a census. Who was where? What did they own? How much taxes did they owe? Etc. When you consider the size of the empire, by the time the empire, it's down here into Palestine and into North Africa, and it's all the way up to Great Britain, across Spain and France, and the Mediterranean world. It's over into Greece and Macedonia, pushing that way, pushing up against the Germans. And you consider that they could hold a census every 5 years. And that people just, it's census time again. I mean, I'm sure they tried to hide stuff from the tax collector and so on because that's human nature, but you don't hear, there's no record of people rebelling against the census. It was just like, the Romans are counting things again. And that was unheard of. I mean, the Greeks had conquered up through Macedonia into Persia and down around, right? They'd come down, they had into the Middle East. But the Greeks never counted people. They weren't that organized. And so what happens by the time the Romans leave the scene is that people just assume that that's what governments do. And it changes the way that people think about government from the Greek idea of government being there to serve the people to the Roman idea of the government being there to enlarge the state, and the citizen's job is to make the state great. And that's an influence that, in a debate that's been going on ever since. So just to wrap up a little bit, a couple of other things to note, because this appears in your book as sort of in passing. One of the things that they did was they divided all the people of Rome into centuries, groups of hundreds, based on basically their wealth. So you had equestrians. They were people who could provide a horse for war. They had horses. Then you had somebody who was first class. They had full armor. And then you'd have, your second class, they have less armor. Not specified in the sources I read. How much less armor? Armor. Can't spell it right at the same time. All right, and so on down. So people who had weapons but no armor, people who had javelins, people whose only weapon was a sling, down to carpenters and trumpeters and so on. And each of those groups in time of war and crisis in the Republic was required to show up with whatever it was that whatever century they were in, that they were supposed to bring. Again, that organization means that they can field an army fairly quickly. And because of where they are, they figure out very fast that when they march, by coming in, the Etruscans have to defend all of this. And the Romans can take shortcuts, and that saves them. It helps them quite a bit when Hannibal is up in this area during the Second Punic War, because they couldn't defeat him. His army was too big, and their horses were afraid of his elephants. But for 14 years, they could nibble at him until he finally got within 3 miles of Rome, had no support from any of the people that they had conquered, the Romans had conquered, and realized he had to go home and went home. Most of his elephants were dead by that point. So again, that organization. The other thing I wanted to touch on is that there's always a great deal of fuss between patricians and the plebeians. So the patricians were descendants of the original Roman families. Plebeians were everybody else. And originally they had no voice in the laws. As you can imagine, what the patricians were concerned with, what the plebeians were concerned with, were always the same. And so the plebeians started early on lobbying for some kind of voice. And the first solution that they came up with was, they said, okay, fine, you all have consuls. We're going to have consuls too, and we're going to call them the consuls of the people. They were totally illegal. There was nothing in the Roman Constitution, because they had a written constitution, that said that the plebeians got a consul. But the plebeians basically surrounded the people that they made consul and prevented the patricians from harming them, and did it so well that after about 100 years, it's completely illegal and nobody would think of touching a consul. And there's actually, at the beginning of the empire, a great to-do about some of that, because some consuls are assassinated and so on. So first they have the consul of the people, but it's not a very good solution, because they still don't really have a voice. They just have somebody that they can appeal to who might be able to talk the patricians into doing what the plebeians want. So they eventually come up with this idea that they're going to have 10 tribunes, and it's the job of the tribunes to collect the vote of the plebeians and present it to the consuls and the Senate. And in theory, it works really well, because the different centuries could vote, and then the tribunes would carry that vote to the Senate and to the consuls, except that because the organization is that if you're a patrician, you have client plebeians who basically are plebeians that owe you loyalty for one reason or another. These 10 tribunes could always have influence brought to bear on them by whichever patricians needed to. So it was almost impossible to get the 10 tribunes to agree on something long enough to carry it to the patricians. But they did say eventually, after at one point the plebeians leave Rome altogether and go to the other side of the Tiber and refuse to come back, at a time of crisis. There's an army marching on Rome. The Nubians are like, oh, look, here's an opportunity, and we don't like the way this war is being run anyway. And so they leave. And the patricians there's not very many of them. So they have to give way some. There's a couple of other episodes that are similar. Eventually, they get what are called the 12 tables. And these are laws supposedly handed down from the ancestors sometime between 451 and 450 BC. Remember, BC counts backwards. They're written on tablets of bronze. They're put up where everybody can see them. And from that point on, whenever there's a political storm, people are constantly appealing to the 12 tables and to their particular interpretation of them. So I hope that gives a little bit better idea both of the geography and what that did and how various nations influenced and tribes influenced one another, and also sort of the Roman character and some basic idea of their government. I will be posting this video both to the Facebook group for Co-op and also to the YouTube channel. There's some other things on the YouTube channel that are well worth watching, including David Macaulay's City. So if you don't have the book, you can watch the lovely little animated film that's been made of it. And I will be sending out the quiz either tonight or tomorrow morning. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all on Monday.